Welcome everybody to the Boston Office 365 user group. Thank you all for joining us. I hope everybody has helped themselves to some food, and we're going to get started. All right. So, meet our organizers. Our organizer, Dimitri I'm sorry, how do you say the last name? Yes. Dimitri is here. David Losey, who is not with us today, and I am Mike Dixon. So we've been running the Office 365 user group for 3.5 years now. 3.5 years now. So if you guys have any questions related to Office 365, SharePoint, or any of its other components, feel free to find any of us and give us a holler. We are also going to be doing a raffle at the end, and our raffle is based on trivia questions that will come out of the presentation, so you have to pay attention. All right. So last time, our last presentation was Sway Your Audience, the Digital Newsletter Development 101, and that was by Christine. How many people were here for that event? That was actually 2 months ago. We ended up skipping last month, so that was a good time. Has anybody used Sway since then?
I haven't figured out how to use it yet.
Yeah. I will tell you this, from my experience, the best thing to do with Sway is to not import the existing PowerPoints and to start them from scratch. It's a lot easier and actually goes a lot faster. So, all right. So I want to get on to updates. There were lots of updates, especially since we skipped a month, and in that month that we skipped, there was Microsoft Ignite. So we're going to dive right into that. We now have co-authoring in Excel. Very cool. This has taken quite a long time since we've had co-authoring in all the other applications for quite some time. So that is now available now. We have enriching teamwork. So this is within Teams. Is this an education version for Teams? So an education branch for Microsoft Teams, which is also now available. And there is a redesigned Yammer app for the iPad. And there were also several new Microsoft products announced. So they've announced Office 2019, SharePoint Server 2019, and also the Office Web Apps 2019, for those that are still running on-prem stuff.
One of those coming, this is only 2017.
Yeah, they just announced that they will exist and that they are going to be doing these things. Yeah.
And the info pack is still not going away?
And that info path is still not going away? Was there news on the info path front?
Yeah, I caught that on the Red Magazine site that they was part of the link to Learn. And info path still doesn't support it.
Okay, yeah.
No new version or anything.
I was just going to say, I mean, so last I heard, InfoPath, they had extended InfoPath's life cycle out to like 2026 or something ridiculous like that. So, and then I also find it very amusing if you go to the Forms website for the new Microsoft Forms product, they have in huge bold letters, this is not a replacement for InfoPath. And they are correct, it is not. But it's interesting that they call it out that loudly. So Microsoft has also expanded their guest access with Microsoft Teams. And we have this nice infographic that's showing how many groups and people are utilizing that. 25 languages in over 181 markets. Anybody in here using Microsoft Teams? Okay, a few of you. Very good. Very good. Oh, and there is a new Office 365 app launcher because we're not done tweaking that yet. So this is available today, apparently. This has not rolled out to my tenant yet. Has anybody seen this in the wild?
No.
No? Yeah, me neither.
Can we find a way to configure our own app launcher?
What do you mean by your own app launcher?
Just add your own.
Yeah, you can do that now. You can actually add your own tiles into that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before it was solely dependent on licensing, right?
For the Microsoft products, but you can actually add your own link in there. Like, for example, I've added a link in my tenant to QuickBooks Online. And not only is it a link to it, but it's also doing password management. And that password is associated with my account.
So we can get rid of all the apps that we don't need and just add our own.
Yeah, you can customize them, but that customization is per user.
Yeah, I'll say, can you set that corporately? I think that's the big issue.
Yeah,
we always
that's
have. Can we set a
can we
corporate
roll it out?
standard? Bang.
So
There's
if
a
you,
user voice right now
Yeah.
to allow administrators to define it for their organization. If you feel passionately about this topic, go on uservoice.microsoft.com and vote for that to become a feature.
yeah. There are some other ways that you can turn some of those things off. I mean, if you're not using the feature, you can turn off the service within the license, and then it won't show up at all.
Globally?
For every user that you've turned that off for, yeah. Yeah, and you can write a PowerShell script that does that, that applies that to all of your users. So we can talk about that afterwards if you'd like. So, yeah, I mean, the primary thing that I'm seeing new in here is recent documents apparently being added to that list. So that's interesting. So Microsoft SharePoint has been recognized as a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for content service platforms. That's very exciting. Very helpful for getting people who are questioning, you know, whether or not Microsoft's really putting money into this or they're going to be around for a while. This can be very helpful information. Visio Online has been announced. So a couple of months ago, they announced, actually it was more than a couple of months ago, I think it was this past spring, they announced the Visio Online viewer. Now we can get Visio Online for editing and actually create Visio documents online.
Do you know how does the migration work?
What's that?
On-prem Visio to online? Have you tried it yet?
So there's not really any migration involved. What it is a method for deploying the application. So what you can do is you can just enable Visio Online for a user, and then you don't have to install the thick client onto their devices. So if you enable that, then they can access the application from any device just by logging into Office 365. So there's no migration because it doesn't affect the files themselves at all. It's just a deployment methodology, or in this case, almost a lack of deployment. So there were tons and tons of things that came out of Ignite. For those of you that weren't able to attend, I highly recommend. They have almost all of their videos available on Channel 9, or their YouTube channel is also very active. I spent quite a bit of time going through and just flagging all of their sessions that were mentioning or talking about Microsoft Teams, because I'm doing a lot of work with Microsoft Teams right now, and I ended up with my own list of like 33 separate hour-long videos. So there's a lot out there, tons of videos. So I highly recommend it. You can go there, pick your poison, whatever you're focused on today, and you'll find at least a handful of videos on those particular applications. Communication sites was one of the big things that they announced. Also, hub sites. Has anybody heard about hub sites? So hub sites are a new thing that were announced at Ignite that are coming out. And basically what it is the ability to create a site that can act as a uniform container for other sites. So for example, when you create a bunch of team sites, every team site creates its own site collection. So maybe you have a grouping of those that are just called clinics. Like we have a different team site for every clinic. You can create a hub site, call it clinics at Acme Corp or Acme Pharma, whatever. And you can join them all that way. And then you have uniformed branding and a uniform navigation across all of those within the hub site. So it's pretty radical because it's a very new thing within the architecture layer of SharePoint. Because before, every site collection was kind of an independent, its own silo. And hub site gives you the ability to kind of string a few of those together in a logical manner. So more on that as more of that comes out. I didn't hear any release dates around that.
First release by the end of this year.
First release by the end of this year. Wow, awesome. Okay, so I'm sure we'll be talking more about that as that comes out. So, yeah.
Is that something more applicable in larger environments where you tend to have multiple site collections?
I would say most companies should have multiple site collections. I would highly recommend that. So no, I would say even in the smaller environments, this would be very applicable. So.
And just to add to that, it's actually intended to be more for smaller environments. If you're a large enterprise or more than a few thousand users, then you're probably going to find that a little bit limited for what other options exist.
So one of the other really big announcements, I'm not going to be able to go through all of these, but one of the other really big announcements was Teams has been announced to be the future of Skype for Business. So eventually the Skype for Business brand will be retired and the Teams client will have all of the chat and dial-in capabilities that currently exists in Skype for Business.
When will that happen?
It's going to be several years from now before they actually cut it out. Right now, the PSTN is in TAP and it's about to go out to first release. Do you know when that's going to first release? I think that's going to first release before the end of the year, but that's going to be the next piece that comes out. Yes, sir.
Have they said if they're using the Skype technology to build that or if they're completely replacing it?
They have said that they are not. So it is a new framework. It's much more closely tied into the SharePoint framework. And all of that is built on some new underlying technologies that honestly are outside of my wheelhouse. So I'm just going to stop there. But yeah, that's why they have this new underlying framework that they're really pushing and they want to get everything onto. And that's why we're seeing a rollover of a lot of products onto these new systems. Some of the differences that you see might not be huge, but the scalability and the replication capabilities of these new systems are dramatically improved, and also the stability of them. So. The other really big one that just came out this past Tuesday was OneDrive Files on Demand is now available in GA. So a couple of quick notes on that. Is everybody familiar with Files on Demand for OneDrive?
No.
So what this is, this is something that we've been asking for quite a while. it grants people the ability to browse files that are in SharePoint or OneDrive from Windows Explorer without having them synced down to Windows, to your local machine. So you can browse your entire folder and file structure within SharePoint on your local machine without having to replicate all of it onto your machine. Very cool stuff. We may do a deeper dive on that at a future point, but some of the requirements for that are actually the Windows 10 Fall Creators Update. So right now it's Windows 10 only, and it requires the Fall Creators Update. The Fall Creators Update was just released on Tuesday. So you need that. Supposedly, that's all you needed, but I found with my experience, and I did it the day of, so maybe they fixed this, but on the day of, just installing the Fall Creators Update didn't do it. You then also had to download the latest version of the OneDrive client, which for some reason was not included in the Fall Creators Update. I got kind of excited, and I did try installing just that latest version of the OneDrive client on another Windows machine that did not have the Fall Creators Update, and that did not work. So you do need both. So you need the new client and the Fall Creators Update. I'm sure within a couple of days, if not already, that the two will come down at the same time. So, any questions on that? All right, cool. All right, so our slides out of order. So now a word from our sponsor. So
It might be, I'm not sure.
yeah. So Dimitri is going to be giving us a presentation on best practices for a seamless migration to SharePoint. But before we do that, we are going to hear a word from our sponsor, which provided us this awesome meal. So please go help yourself to some of this meal, but not yet. Let's hear what they have to say. So.
All right, so I'll kick this off. Before we get started, quick question. Who here is planning a migration or is in the middle of a migration?
I just migrated.
Just migrated, great.
Only one?
Just one, okay. Who here is still primarily on premises? Who's primarily in the cloud? Okay, perfect. So in today's session, we'll basically talk through best practices for migration. I titled the session to Office 365 or to SharePoint Online, but most of these fundamentals would really apply to any version of SharePoint. So if you are looking at SharePoint 2016 on-prem or you're looking at 2019 in a few years, I think there's a lot of takeaways that you can take here to make your project a success. So a little bit about myself. I've been working with SharePoint for a very long time, well over 10 years. And I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly. I've had a chance to work with a lot of Fortune 100s and helping them migrate to the cloud. I was fortunate to be able to lead a migration project, which was the third largest migration in Office 365 history, in the first of their new dedicated vNext environment, which was in Europe. So I've seen projects work well, I've seen projects struggle, and we're talking about projects from a 10 to 15 person organization all the way up to 150,000 employees, which that third largest one was part of. So we've definitely seen things work well and not work well. I currently work for Turn Digital, which is a company I co-founded earlier this year. Before that, I was the North America SharePoint practice lead for Cognizant. I had about 300 consultants working for me in North America, about 1,200 more overseas. Before that, I was with EMC Consulting, and before that, a number of other smaller consulting companies and startups. So enough about me. Let's dive in. So there's 9 topics I want to talk about today in the tied together with the how to be successful in a migration project. So the first step is to do your portfolio analysis. And the second step is to establish the right governance. Then centralize and communicate effectively. Architect the actual technical side of the migration, all of those things that you need to worry about to really make sure it works well. How to manage customizations. Most of SharePoint environments that are on premises have some level of customization. It could be as simple as some bamboo web parts that somebody once purchased to full-blown web applications that your developers or third parties have written. And there's different ways to handle it when you're moving to the cloud depending on what you need and what you have. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about how you can build a migration runbook so that when it comes time to actually start migrating, you're not doing much thinking. You should be practically brain dead when it comes to doing migrations because everything should already be analyzed, planned, and with a runbook that you can follow the checkboxes to make sure you're not forgetting anything, but also you really shouldn't be doing too much crunching during that time period. We'll talk a little bit about what a known error database is and how that could be effective with larger scale migrations. We'll talk about how we can mitigate user disruption throughout the entire process. And we'll finish it up with how to drive adoption once you already migrate and take that a step forward. These slides will be available on my blog after this session, so feel free to take as many pictures as you want, but you'll also have reference material afterwards. So let's talk about the first part is portfolio analysis. So when you first start your project, your goal is to really understand every single aspect of your environment. Because if you don't understand every aspect of your environment, then you don't really know what you're migrating. And it's kind of like getting into a car without a known destination. You could probably get into the general direction in the very early stages, but unless you start mapping out your routes, you're probably going to go in ways that will take longer than it could take you, or you might end up in a completely wrong place from where you wanted to get to. So knowing every detail is important. It's also complicated, right? So there's a few different levels of things that we look at when we look at portfolio analysis. So one is on the infrastructure side of your existing environments. What does your physical and logical architecture look like? How many farms do you have? Where are they? What does your high availability look like? Do you have different dedicated search farms or shared services farms that are serving multiple different needs beyond just SharePoint? What is your capacity today? If I start pumping out 100 gigabytes an hour of content out of your environment, will that slow down production to a halt, or do you have the capacity to handle that? As well as how do you manage identity? I've seen a lot of migrations hiccup because they would start the project, they identify Active Directory as their primary identity store, and then somewhere about 3/4 of the way through the migration, there are some external users that are using some forms-based authentication or some other set of details that were completely different and completely unknown at the start of the project. And that opens up a whole can of worms because managing external users in the cloud is very different than on-prem. But understanding all these details on the infrastructure side before you begin is very critical. This, of course, is not a completely comprehensive list, but if you hit each of these categories, you'll probably uncover other aspects that you should be aware of. The second aspect is from a customizations perspective. So we have business applications, and a business application does not have to be code. It could be a simple thing like finance uploads an invoice into one location as they receive it. There's a workflow that's triggered that alerts a different group. Accounts payable gets issued to go write a check. There could or could not be a tie into the check processing company. But something like this could be considered a business application. And when you migrate things like these to the cloud, they could or could not work. But if you identify these as business applications, you'll have the ability to create the test plans, invite the right stakeholders, do a trial with them if necessary. And furthermore, if there are customizations, then it's an absolutely critical thing to do.
So from a business analysis perspective, this is maybe also a time to take a look at, maybe something I build custom in SharePoint, is it time to get something on the shelf?
Absolutely. I mean, anytime you do migrations, it's a great opportunity to clean house and also see if there's customizations you had to build or buy in previous versions that are now available out of the box in the latest version. We see this all the time. In fact, if you look at Bamboo Solutions or KWiscom or some of these other vendors that were huge in the SharePoint 2007 and 2010 days, you'll see most of their components have not been maintained for the cloud because they're just no longer needed. Like cascading dropdowns was a huge one in 2007, and now Microsoft allows you to do a basic version of that with additional columns. So just little things like that, but definitely worth considering. Great point, Deb. From a custom perspective, you have commercial off the shelf, things like K2, Nintex, and so forth. You might have open source things that you downloaded from Codeplex, or somebody's blog post that put 20 lines of JavaScript code that let you go do some interesting things. Those should be considered because, again, when you're moving to the cloud, things could work or they could break. But knowing that you have that gives you that power to make a decision to rectify that before it happens. Or you can choose to ignore it, but at least you know it's there. And your boss is not surprised when someone comes in and says, oh, nothing's working, et cetera. You know, you could lay that back to a decision that was made to not pay attention to these, you know, grassroots customizations that might exist in your environment. Is there a question?
So if you have 1,000 sites, for example, and there are a lot of applications on those, how do you handle that as one or two people are actually doing the migration?
So that's a great question. So the question is, if we have a small team but thousands of sites, how do we know what's where? There's a lot of great scripts available with most migration tools that will analyze your sites and report back what kind of features are activated. So in on-premises world, if you're following best practices, every customization is deployed through a feature which rolls up to be part of a module, which rolls up to be part of a WSP package. There's new ways of doing things with remote provisioning if you're really bleeding edge, but if you have that many applications, a small team, you're probably focused on that area. So it's really to understand where are they first of all activated. There's additional steps you could take to see which pages have custom web parts if the customizations are web part. One common thing that we would do is to take a dump of all of your WSPs that are in your solution administration in central admin. And there's PowerShell scripts available online that you could export your existing stores. Those WSP files are really just compressed files. They're cab files or zip files. And you can actually expand them and look at the manifest to understand what different modules and features were part of this package. What were they scoped to, whether the farm, the web app, site collection, the subsite, or I think that's the main ones. And from there, basically start to do systematic analysis. The other aspect is, are you looking to migrate everything in one shot, or are there some low-hanging fruit like vanilla collaboration sites that might be the better way to start? So there's ways that you could time it as well so that you're not completely overwhelmed. We're not saying you need to understand your entire platform on day one, but you need to understand it enough to make sure that as you're beginning to migrate, those parts that you're aligning and scheduling, you fully understand. Does that help answer? Okay. Branding is another aspect. Just about every corporation that had more than a few thousand employees had a branded version of their SharePoint site when dealing with on-premises. Some did as simple as a logo that appears standard across all sites. Some went all the way further in making their SharePoint sites look nothing like SharePoint. These customizations are guaranteed to break when you migrate to the cloud. There's no way that what you have will work. I'm sorry, it's true. There's different designers available in the cloud. Our recommendation is always keep your customizations as simple as possible. We do not advocate branding Office 365 to the fullest extent. So what we mean by that is set your colors, set your logo, set your quick links, the little icon that you could click on for your collaboration areas. And the reason we say that is because even if you can customize and brand your SharePoint sites, as soon as somebody goes into Yammer or Teams or Delve or any of the other applications, they're going to lose your corporate header, your mega menu navigation, and so forth. So instead of fighting Microsoft on this, which we all will lose because there's still no way to inject things into Delve or Yammer in the correct way, it's better to just embrace it and keep things simple. Now, if you're building a company intranet, that is the one exception I would make where it makes sense to actually take it a step further and really invest in some good branding for that experience. But your collaboration sites, your project sites, etc., keep it simple, use the colors, don't overcomplicate things. And we can talk more about that if you'd like afterwards. The other part is around internal external dependencies. So many times there might be other services outside of SharePoint that are connecting to SharePoint services to grab a copy of a file and send it to somebody, or to go and interface and sync calendars between SharePoint and your other ERP systems or project management systems. You might also have dependencies where you're importing profile information from your HR system in addition to Active Directory. So it's important to just document what those are and then evaluate what the path forward is if there needs to be a path forward. It's usually difficult to find out which applications are externally dependent on SharePoint. Usually a user survey helps find the ones that are actually being used. But in terms of SharePoint going out, there's a lot of capabilities to go through and see what are those items in your secure store, what are those business data connections that you have, and what else is just configured outside of that. Ideally, IT would have perfect documentation of all of these interactions, but that rarely happens, unfortunately. The next part is to analyze the content. So understand what your information architecture is. What is your structure? Who owns it? Do you have records that need to be managed in a special way? Are there last modified and access dates that you can pull forward to see where the content is stale and when the content can maybe be retired or archived or deleted instead of migrated? And also look at the size and complexity. If you have a site collection that has a handful of document libraries, and even if it's 100 gigabytes large, it's a pretty simple site to migrate. If you have a site that has 1,800 subsites with different levels of permissions and complete chaos, and if you only have one site collection, it might be like that, then I would classify that as very complex, even if you don't have a single workflow on it. Right? So as you're looking at the different components that make a site simple or complex, and we'll talk about that in just a few slides, it's important to know what you're doing. Generally speaking, if we do have the opportunity to do a several-week analysis at the start of the project to set the baseline, I would always recommend migrating your easy sites first for a few reasons. One, it validates that your runbook is working correctly as intended, and if not, you have opportunities to correct it with the easy stuff. Two, if you have complex things that you might want to do a POC or a test migration, it gives you that timeline to do so before you're scheduling those to go into production. And the third is it builds up positive momentum in your company. So if you're starting a migration project and your first site blows up, not due to any fault of your own, but due to something else happening externally, that looks bad on the migration team and IT as a whole because the users don't know, and they don't know and they shouldn't know, and they don't really care. Right? So by doing the simple things first, you build up some of that positive momentum. Users are starting to get excited. They get these new features. It's easier to use. It's faster. And then if you stumble later on, which hopefully you don't, but if you do, it's usually more forgivable. After you move kind of past that first quarter or so of migrations, that's when I would start introducing a healthy mix of simple, medium, complex, so that you can keep up with your pace to test those additional complexities while still being able to show volume of content transferred across. We'll talk more about different ways to approach that in a bit. Last part here is if you have regulated content, it's very critical that you identify that up front. If you have GXP sites in the healthcare space, or if you have HIPAA or any other content that needs special procedures, you need to know that. Because if you have a validated environment, you need strict documentation for who's accessing the data, who has access, who's moving it, what settings are being changed. And if you're treating this as like a normal collaboration site, you're going to break all of those policies and put your company at risk. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And the fourth thing to really analyze are who are your stakeholders. So who are the business owners for your application? Who's using your platform that you're servicing to your end clients? Who are the site owners? Are your site owner list accurate? If they're not accurate, what's the right method to identify who owns in the business a piece of content that has no valid owners associated to it? Look at your geographical locations. If you have clients that have users in different countries in the world, you might need to accommodate them from a timing perspective, localization perspective, calendar perspective, language perspective. Many global companies will have communications teams dedicated for each country that will actually go and translate all of your messaging and work with the users if their native language is not English. It all depends. From my experience, most companies in Europe, English was not an issue, but with some of the larger global companies, like Japan was particularly something where most of the people in one company that were working in Japan, they used Japanese as their first language. So all official documents that were created out of that location were all in Japanese. And we actually worked with a vendor, a third-party vendor that was local to that company in Japan, whose sole job it was to translate things between Japanese and English for the rest of the company. It was very interesting, but had we not known that in the beginning and we started to send out our mass communications and planning, there'd be a lot of pushback and we might not have gotten the right message across to the right people. Any questions so far? Any questions, just raise your hands. We don't have to wait until the end. So how do you approach portfolio analysis? So the first thing you want to do is do a really high level inventory as you're getting started. And I'm picturing this not as somebody who might be familiar with your environment, but somebody that might just be hired to a company for the first time because everyone in IT just won the lottery and there's no documentation and you're coming in to go do a migration and you are completely clueless, but you have the admin password and you're asked to go and run with it. So the first part, do a very high level inventory. Look at your farms, look at how many different farms you have, what are the high level site collections, what are those high level solutions that you have deployed on the central admin level, and who are the stakeholders that are kind of responsible. It could be different business unit leaders, it could be smaller teams, just who's kind of there that you can work with to learn more about what's going on. From there, once you have this high level, now you know which areas to target to do a more in-depth analysis. And this could be a parallel task if you have a team of a few people that can go focus on different areas. This could be very linear. It all depends on your timelines and your bandwidth and your capacity. But look at the last modified and the last access dates. Look at how many users or members there are in these different sites. And then create like an activity heat map. Excel and Power BI and Power Query, they all give you the tools to make really nice visualizations by just dumping a ton of raw data into a spreadsheet. So from there, understand what are the most active areas that you have to really be most focused on. Because the old things, you could probably take a decision to either archive it, do it last, do something else with it. But your active ones, those are going to be your main focus area. Because if you have an inactive site collection that has a Bamboo color calendar web part and it hasn't been accessed in 2 years, you really don't need to worry about how you're going to migrate this customization to the cloud. You're going to let it die in 99 out of 100 times. But if you don't have the activity information, and if you treat all site collections as equals, then you'll get to the point where you're wasting a lot of cycles on things that don't really matter in the bigger picture. So that's the next part. So after you understand who your users are, who your site owners are, start to put together some surveys to send out to them. Many clients use things like SurveyMonkey, free edition or paid edition if there's more analysis and more users required. And really ask them, do you need your site migrated? Are you still using this? Is there any information in here that is valuable? And if there are customizations that you identify that are part of those sites, just ask them, are you using these customizations? They might come back and say yes. They might come back and say no. They might come back and say, I have no idea what you're talking about. Can we meet to discuss further? But it's a good conversation going because you're starting to plant the idea that this migration is happening and you're requiring their help to make this successful. And then from there, you can start actually planning things out. Now, if you identify 100 sites that have a Bamboo calendar, you can set up one workshop and invite as many of those different 100 site owners as possible. So you go through it one time, explain what it is, explain that it's not compatible, explain what the out-of-box options are, and get their buy-in to cut down the effort that it will take to migrate. Because any migration project, I've been involved in a lot of them, it's successful if we migrated the things that we need into the cloud. It's not successful because we moved everything from one platform to another. In fact, by many measures, it's not successful if you've moved absolutely everything. So being able to get into a lean, efficient machine of being able to just get what you need to be successful and retire, archive, whatever else, the old stuff, that's what we all want to get to. Now, as a consultant, if you come to me and say, hey, I want to migrate 100 terabytes, that'd be perfect. Okay, I could bill for a couple of years at a time. But reality, if you only need a quarter of that or even less, that's actually better for the business. And the last part is the detailed analysis and inventory of the finalized sites. So here's where you want to start going into the actual details behind how many versions of documents are there in all the document libraries in the sites. Many site owners don't enable versioning, And for good reason, they don't know it's an option, or they don't know they can specify how many to keep. So that's where you want to start getting to that next level of detail, to be able to start to categorize your sites as simple, medium, complex. And there's a lot of ways to slice and dice that. And then once you start to look at the customizations, you can also start grouping them together. Like sites that only have SharePoint Designer workflows go into one bucket. Sites that have some Nintex workflows go here. Sites that have a custom web part and Nintex and something else, let's put this into another bucket and sit down with those site owners and make sure that we understand how they're using it so we make sure it migrates successfully. So we talked about determining the complexity of the sites that you're moving. Here's some criteria that we use. It's not 100% comprehensive, but if you start to come up with the list detailing these bits of data, you'll start to get a pretty clear picture of where things stand across your environment. And to answer the question from earlier, I'm not saying do this by hand. If you go on Google, there's plenty of PowerShell scripts. Most migration tools have reports that will give you this information. If you're working with Fast Track, Microsoft has a tool that will give you all this information. It's actually also available on Microsoft Downloads. So a lot of ways to get this, but do take the information and then start looking at where you stand. And then if you're looking at customization complexity, here's another set of criteria that you could look at. So if you have like full trust code, that's not going to migrate. If you have sandbox solutions that have code behind them, it's not going to migrate. If you have inline JavaScript, you need to evaluate whether that inline JavaScript will still work in the cloud. Right? We have the whole CSOM model. So if you built a client-side customization using SharePoint 2013 CSOM, chances are it'll work in the cloud. If you're making legacy web service calls that were there from SharePoint in 2007, it might work, it might not work, but it would be a good thing to go and double down on your testing. So again, this is more takeaway. I'm not going to walk through one by one of these. Okay, any questions before we move on to governance? Okay, so any one of these boxes, by the way, I could probably spend 4 to 6 hours talking about. I'm condensing all of these down to about 5 to 7 minute segments. So if you have any questions, we can always talk more in detail afterwards. So governance, high level, these are the steps to be successful in governance. First, assemble the right team. Then determine what the goals and objectives are that you're trying to achieve by doing governance as a whole. Classify and prioritize what your goals and objectives are. Determine the processes to get and meet those goals and objectives. Determine what's possible out of the box, what's in the roadmap, and what you have to do to fill the gaps. Build a roadmap to fill the gaps, and then communicate your policies. So in a little bit more detail across these. So assemble the right team. If you're a small company, then putting together one SharePoint and one Office 365 governance committee would be sufficient. When we put together a governance committee, you want representation from all the key divisions or departments in your organization that will be using the platform. If you just have an IT governance committee, it's pretty much useless because the entire part of the governance committee is to understand where the business goals are in the organization and make sure that IT is enabling these business goals to be achieved through technology. So have your users represented in this, it's super critical. If you're a slightly larger company, you might break this up into 2 categories. One is a governance committee, one is a steering committee. Steering committee is usually more at the VP or CXO level. And those are usually dictating the broader company visions and strategies and letting those kind of cascade down to the steering committee, which helps decide, or the governance committee, which helps decide when the technology is ready to kind of align with that and how it could align with that. And if you're in a very large company, you would probably have a separate steering committee and then a separate governance committee for your application services and your infrastructure services. Application services, I'm talking about things like SharePoint, Yammer, Delve, things that are more on the app dev customization potentially side. And the infrastructure side would be things more like your identity management, your Exchange, your Skype for Business / Teams, kind of more on the core of it. The reason I say that this is split in most organizations is because even though Office 365 is aiming to unite both parties into one platform, in most companies, there's still a very different skill set if you're an IT pro / admin versus if you're a developer focused more on application services. That's just how it is today. Will it change in the future? Very possible. It could be possible your organization has already combined these. But if you are a large organization, let's say over 20,000 employees, and you've combined both together, I'd love to talk after. I'd love to learn more about how you went through that process. Okay, determine goals and objectives. So there's 3 categories of different governance that we typically see. One is platform governance. So this is what affects the entire platform. Basically what you need to be a global admin to configure. So things like your identity, your search, your shared services, your compliance, how you manage hybrid configurations. So that's kind of one category. Typically, IT is very heavily invested in this first column because this is what they need to do hands-on and manage hands-on. The second is around information management. This is really about your information architecture, who has access to which sites and how that gets applied, what is your taxonomy and retention policies. The second pillar is usually more on the business side, more on the chief information officer from the information side aspect. Legal usually has a strong opinion about what is retention and what is considered a record and so forth. And the third is around custom solutions. So as you start to extend Office 365, what is allowed, what is not allowed? Will you develop standards and reusable tools, like reusable way of logging errors across all of your customizations that you want to build? If you have multiple vendors coming in, building different parts, how do you manage that? If HR wants to go hire a local consulting company to go build something, a great module for the HR intranet site, how do you manage them? What is the proper engagement process? And then who owns it after they're done, right? What is the application lifecycle after that customization is built? So with this, it's usually, again, back to IT, really focusing in on, how we're going to manage and govern this platform moving forward. So we've identified, we've identified the different categories of governance. And within each of those categories, we really need to go and classify and prioritize what are we trying to do. We shouldn't get together in a room and say, yes, we're going to do governance. Okay, what are these 18 options that we have? Okay, let's set all these 18 options and let's go do stuff and really lock things down and make it restrictive. It really shouldn't be that way. We should really identify what our goal is. So for example, a goal could be to say, we want to make sure we're not leaking PII or social security numbers outside of our organization to external email addresses. Shouldn't be an email in the first place, but that's a separate thing. Let's say we don't want to leak that externally. So that's a goal and objective. And if you were to prioritize them, it would definitely be a showstopper, right? If we can't stop people from doing this, we're going to fail our audits. We're not going to be good. We have to put a DLP policy in place to prevent that. So that would be a very good reason to go and turn on DLP. If you don't have such concerns or objectives or goals, or your company doesn't deal with that kind of information to begin with, then it's a nice to have. And you really shouldn't overstress applying policies to your company just because you could. There really should be tiebacks to what you're looking to do and what the goals are. And the reason it's so critical to document these goals is because people change roles, people change companies, technology evolves, and sometimes the decision that you make today is due to a technical constraint that might not be applicable tomorrow. Or there's a new policy coming in place or a new direction for the company, and decisions that you made back then, you weren't sure why you made them. But at that point, you don't want to go back and undo it because the amount of work it would be to get to the bottom of why some decision was made 5 years ago could be pretty much impossible. So most people, want to cover themselves, make sure they're not breaking anything, especially if legal is involved, and then it goes sight unseen. So define your objectives, prioritize them, classify them, and keep a record of that as you make changes to your environment to enforce governance. You have to have that traceability matrix to tie back to why we made that decision and how we decided to implement that decision. So the other part is understand the processes to get to those objectives. So the first part is on the business side. I'll give you an example. Let's say we want to enable self-provisioning for different services in Office 365. So let's say I'm a user and I have a new project I'm starting. I want to put together a quick area where my team can go collaborate, share files, share calendars, manage the project timeline. And so I want to request a space for it. So typically I'll fill out a form that says, this is what I need a space for, this is the template I want. But from there, a governance policy might say that my manager needs to approve it if I'm not at a certain rank in the company. So for my manager to approve it, it means, first of all, my manager needs to be accurate in Active Directory, which is a process thing. Secondly, we might need to determine what are the different questions I need to answer to determine if I need approval. So a question could say, will external people to the company be accessing the site? And maybe if I say yes, there's an additional approval. If I say no, it gets automatically created. So it's really always a business question of what do we need to do? What kind of process do we need to follow to make sure we're protecting our assets and meeting our objectives, right? Nothing to do with technology. It's really on the business side. And then on the flip side, we also need technology to make that happen. So maybe we need to build a workflow. Or maybe on day one, if we're a small company, we identify the manager has to approve it, but we don't have the funds or the time to build a self-provisioning form. Maybe they just open up a help desk ticket, and then the help desk L1 rep calls the manager and gets the verbal approval. Right? It doesn't have to be fully automated on day one, but as long as we define the processes and we define what's going on, we'll be on track to governing our platform. The other aspect is, once we identify what we are looking to accomplish, we need to really see what could we do out of the box. And if there are gaps, what could we do with them? So the first is, what can we configure? Like DLP was an example I used earlier. Microsoft has about 50 different DLP templates in place today. If you're looking at a large enterprise, you might have DLP engines in-house that have millions of different rules. We were working with one financial company in New York City, and they had like a Ferrari of a data governance, security, compliance engine. I forget the name of it. But it could do things where if you uploaded some, or you tried to share some information with someone's social security number once, it would block it. If you did it 3 times within 15 minutes, it would go and disable your account and notify your manager. Like, it has some really advanced policies that it could apply. It also, at the time, had the ability to do deeper scanning. It could actually unzip zip files in your attachments and do a detailed scan. It could go like 10 levels of compression, like 10 different nested zip files. It could do a whole lot of things. They were looking at the cloud, and Microsoft has these policies, but they're not as robust, right? So one of the things that this company had to determine was whether or not that was okay for day one, and if it was on Microsoft's roadmap to fix it, and if so, or improve it rather, and if so, does it make sense to hold it out? Do we stop the migration? Do we try to do something else in parallel? So things like that is what we need to really look at. And Microsoft has a public roadmap. This is the latest URL to it. They keep changing it. It used to be fasttrack.office.com/roadmap. Now it's here. It'll probably change again. But this is the public roadmap. If you are a large enough client, you could talk to your Microsoft account rep, and you can have a private NDA discussion with Microsoft, and they could share a bit more information about what's coming, what are the rough timelines. Of course, none of it is committed to, but they can give you an idea and direction. And a lot of times that's enough to influence these high-level decisions. So the other aspect is, once you do identify gaps, how do you build a roadmap to go take care of it? It should be roughly a 3 to 24 month roadmap, depending on how many gaps you have and how critical they are. But take a look at free online add-ins and scripts. There's millions of things, whether you're looking at Codeplex, which is actually shutting down, I think, this month. They've migrated all the projects to GitHub. There's also Microsoft TechNet downloads that communities could basically publish wikis along with files. There's a million MVPs with great blogs out there. It shouldn't be hard to find most solutions to most things. But sometimes you can't, and sometimes you need something more robust, like a Nintex or K2 or something else. That's where you should look at off-the-shelf components. And of course, you could also build your own components. Right? There's a ton of examples, a ton of PowerShells you could build and automate things, even if you're not a developer. Things have really, the bar has been lowered to customize 365 a ton compared to where it was 10 years ago. And don't forget, not all policies have to be on day one. So a great example is a shelf life for a site collection. I always advocate to put a 1-year shelf life on any site that gets created, because chances are you're not going to need that site after 1 year. But if you do, you have the option to renew it for another year. And that way it sets the right mindset for your users when they're creating the site, that this is not here forever. And if I want to retain knowledge that's company knowledge, I should probably put that somewhere into a record center or somewhere else that's there for long-term company knowledge. This should be a temporary thing, well, temporary, year long. But keep in mind, if you have that policy as something that you are enforcing, the earliest you could ever enforce this policy is a year after the first person makes their site collection, right? So you don't need to focus all of your energy on building this automated deletion or renewal process on day one. You just need to capture the information, notify the user, this site will expire on this date. Yeah.
So one of the things you gotta think about then is data retention, because you can easily lose very much needed documentation that's going to be needed down further down the road. So you need a retention policy set up before you even set up a site deletion policy.
Or stay a good backup system.
So a trick of the trade.
Deleting in the backup, or you're going to be deleting everything.
So a trick of the trade is that nobody actually enforces these shelf lives
Yeah.
on site collections. But you set the right context on day one. And when it comes time to go and nuke sites or ask for renewals, you could select who you want to enforce it with and not. Most companies do not automate that process, but they will automate things like reminder alerts, alerts asking for renewals, survey emails going out saying, do you still need the site, or can we retire or archive it based on policy? But it's something that, it could be a must-have, but it doesn't have to be built on day one.
So it's a good scare tactic.
It's a good scare tactic, but also it gives you that runway of a year to actually build the processes and everything else needed while setting the expectation that it's going to happen.
Yeah, no, that's good. I like it.
You can't come after a year and say, yes, we're deleting your site 'cause it's been around for a year, right? Any questions on governance before we move on to effective communication? Okay. So one thing that most companies fail at doing is to build an internal marketing campaign about the migration project. Some companies will put a blog post out or send out an email saying, hey, migration's coming, we'll let you know more details. But they don't really work to sell it internally. As a result, many times the business sees IT shoving yet another thing onto them that they may or may not want. They don't really understand why it's there, why is things changing, how am I going to benefit? We'll talk more about some of those concerns in a bit, but really build that internal campaign. Put up flyers, get a site dedicated to this migration project where people can come in and ask questions and get FAQs and really understand what are the benefits of why we're doing this. So to do so, first of all, build out your target lists. Understand who you want to communicate to as part of this overall project communications. So one list could be a list of people that have customizations. And if you have a lot of different customizations, maybe create different targeted lists based on what type of customization. I always refer to Bamboo Calendar because probably 95% of SharePoint 2007 platforms had Bamboo Color Calendar as a customized deployment. So I'll keep picking on that one. But in this case, you could create a targeted email distribution list for site owners of sites that have one or more Bamboo calendars. Similar for other customizations. Then you probably want a target list for owners because for each of these different targeted lists, you'll have different communications and surveys that you need to send out to them. So site owners could be things like preparing for training for what's coming, understanding what the impacts are, understanding the process, understanding what we'll communicate in the future as we get closer to the migration date, what they have to do, like stop running workflows and other pre-migration steps that have to execute. Large lists is another example. If you have used sites that have large lists that will not migrate well into the cloud, you might want to target them and continue to harass them to go reduce the sizes and then offer them solutions or abilities to go and fix that themselves or work with IT to split the lists into multiple lists or add columns, indexes, a lot of ways to mitigate some of those challenges. But again, build out who your different audiences will be as you communicate. Determine the correct channels. Posters work incredibly well. If your company has digital signage like TVs that advertise things in the hallways or elevators, another great avenue that you can use to distribute information. Email is king in most companies, but also do blog posts, do lunch sessions. We're working with one client right now that has a culture of doing beer and wine sessions, where if a project is at the right milestone where they want to open up discussion to the broader company, they will host a beer and wine session in one of their large event spaces. And people could come in, ask questions. The project team would wear either like a lei or a pin that signifies they're part of the team. Come talk to me, come ask me questions. It really makes it more of like we're in this together, we're all going through this together. Let's work together on this to make it successful. So know your audience and create your appropriate messages. If you're targeting people that have large lists, you probably need to explain what a large list is, what the challenges are, how they could fix it themselves, or how to reach out to you to set up time to work together. If you're communicating to all site owners, you could probably be a little bit more higher level and just say, change is coming. Please make sure you attend one of these 5 training sessions that will be required for you to be certified to be a site owner on the new platform. So kind of start to segment them because you will be communicating different messages at different times throughout the project. Also, be transparent with your site owners. Don't leave them in the dark. They are our allies. They are the ones that are going to say, yes, this was successful, and then sign off on that successful migration. If you start a war with your site owners early on, it's going to be a very brutal project for the remainder of it. So be friendly, be transparent. If you make a mistake, let them know, right? They're people. And there are some very, high pressure companies where having a mistake means that you're an idiot. Most of the time, we're seeing companies that are more transparent are being able to build better relationships with their stakeholders, because we all make mistakes, but trying to hide everything and trying to be very formal that I'm sorry, you're not part of the team, I'm not giving you this information, it doesn't set the right tone going forward. Because keep in mind, after you do the migration, these are still your clients that you're servicing with your platform. And if you start to see them as the enemy during the migration, it's not going to get any better once you're doing this. Because at the end of the day, we're building these technologies and we're building these platforms to service our customers, to enable the business to be more productive. So let's build alliances as part of this process instead of continuing what might have been the status quo or worsening the relationship. So we talked about creating a site to go post all of this information, make it very clear. And then the other aspect is you want to establish some kind of survey system. SurveyMonkey is a great example. There's a million other tools. Many companies have internal tools as well. But you want to reach out to your site owners and ask if they have any blackout dates. Like your finance department might have blackout dates at the end and start of each quarter, especially at the end and start of the year. Other business units or other subdivisions might be doing product launches, or they might have other periods throughout the year that they just cannot be down. They can't spend a day without having access to their sites. So just communicate that up front. It'll help with the planning process. And also you can ask them those questions about, do you really need your site, and so forth. Any questions about effective communications? It's tough to compress everything into such short bits, but we'll keep moving. Okay, so architecting the migration. So a lot of people start architecting the migration really looking at what they have now and seeing what they could do better. So kind of like, if you're in the market for a new car and you have a Toyota Camry today, you'll take a look at the new version of the Toyota Camry and you're like, oh great, we have like backup sensors and automatic braking and everything, which is perfect because it's a better version than what you have today, but you're gonna use it the same exact way. If you design and build a house without looking exactly at what you have in detail today, this could open up your imagination, open your eyes up to more options that you might not have thought it would have been possible before. So if you're going to build a new house, you wouldn't want to build the same exact floor plan as your current house with just nicer features like automatic windows that can open and close with the touch of a button. If you wanted that, you could have probably done a few things here on the old way of doing things and improved it a little bit more. You want to build a new house because you want to take advantage of the new features. When you're looking at Office 365, it's not just SharePoint Online. You have a lot of options out there. You have things like Delve, which provides the Office Graph integration for your latest activities in your social circle. You have things like MS Teams now. You have Office 365 groups. You have Yammer, which you may or may not have had before. We could talk more about Yammer at the beer hour afterwards. But there's a lot of things. So reimagine how you could work together. Now, I'm not saying you have to throw away what you have and start completely fresh, but build a new house and see where these old portions would map into that house, right? So you're still going to have a bedroom, but does it need to be the same exact layout with the 4 feet on each side of the bed from the wall? Or if you could start with a blank slate, could you make that better but still fit all your furniture into a new home that would be better for you to use, right? So look at your information architecture, look at your governance policies. I can't tell you how many companies have a 45-page or larger governance document for their on-premises SharePoint that the last person to read was the last person that wrote it for them 5 years ago. And then they give you the stack and they're like, okay, this is our governance policies for our company. Go apply this to the cloud. My recommendation is always to just toss it out. Like, let's start fresh. There's no point in trying to enforce archaic policies that might have applied on-prem in the cloud. Because on-prem, and rightfully so, your infrastructure team needs to keep the lights on, right? They need to make sure your environment does not go down. So let's be very strict about customizations. Let's be very strict about file sizes. Let's be very strict about how many site collections in a single database. Let's be very strict about list thresholds. The list goes on. A lot of these concerns are no longer applicable once you're in the cloud because it's not your infrastructure team's problem anymore. It's Microsoft's problem. And if your servers are taking up a lot of resources, they'll just add another web front end to offset that. Right? It's not really your concern if your farm will go down because it's Microsoft's problem. That's what I like about Office 365. Look at identity management. External identity is very important, but internal identity is also important. The easiest configuration is to load up Azure AD in the cloud, set up ADFS, and in the course of a weekend, you can have a fully configured single sign-on between your on-prem and the cloud. But there are other options. Right? If you're looking at cloud as a broader strategy with a lot of other applications like Salesforce, HubSpot, QuickBooks, others plugging into it, you might want to look at some of the more advanced options of Azure AD or Azure AD Domain Services, which is a new release. You could also look at your broader approach to how your end users reach all these different applications. Okta, Ping, a number of other companies also offer very strong solutions in the space, and this could give you an ability to kind of rethink how you do things. I'll give you like one demo I saw, and to be completely honest, I forgot which company demoed this, but they had two-factor authentication with geo-presence capabilities. So what they did was they would connect all of their company, so this was an identity management provider, I forget who it is. They'll kill me if they know this, but their client, their executives traveled all the time. It was a global organization. And they wanted to make sure that if someone was accessing one of their accounts, that it was actually the person that was supposed to be there. So they actually configured their identity management tool to sync with their travel provider company, which was Concur, and basically see if where the person's logging in from geographically matches with where they're supposed to be. So if somebody's traveling from New York to Seattle and someone's trying to multi-factor authenticate from China, they would block that. And you actually set up perimeters. They had another great example where there was a movie studio where they would give a script to one of their actors or actresses, and then they wanted to make sure they could not access that document if they were outside of their campus or if they were in the campus of one of their competitors. So they would actually map that information to either allow or block on that. It's just one example. Microsoft doesn't do any of these things yet. They might in the future. But there's a whole world of identity management out there. Cool thing to reconsider if you have sensitive data. Workspace provisioning. So we're talking about provisioning. We talk about branding. Okay. So the next thing is determine your migration methodology. Test your bandwidth. I mean, the number one question I get when I'm asked to propose a migration plan is, how long is this going to take me? And companies never actually do bandwidth testing. So they don't know their speed. They say, okay, well, I have like a 10 megabit pipe coming in, but there's no analysis done further usually until we start to really probe them for it about, okay, well, how much of that could be dedicated to the project? How much of that, what is your capacity today? Are there certain times of the day or certain times of the month that you have more bandwidth available than others? And how do we really plan around that? There's also the big bang approach versus a phase approach. If you're a larger company, you might do a handful of site collections a day, a week, a month, depending on the complexities and the rates. If you're a large company and if you're a smaller company and you want to do it in one shot, maybe your users are okay with having read-only access for a weekend and you do it then. There's also ways where you could do all of your migrations behind the scenes and then just do a delta migration for like a short blackout period. There's pros and cons to every approach, and we could talk more about that later if anyone's interested. There's also the front door migration, which uses SharePoint Online's REST APIs that are susceptible to being throttled if you're sending too much information too quickly. There's also what Microsoft calls their backdoor method, which is through Azure Blob Storage. The idea is you take a manifest file, you upload that to the front end, and you tell it the location of where you put all your blobs, your binary objects in Azure storage in the back end. And then Microsoft has a job to pull that out of Azure Blob Storage and put that into the database behind the scenes. That works very fast for larger migrations, but it also takes a little bit more overhead to configure. So depending on how fast you're looking to migrate, there could be advantages of doing it one way, both ways, or doing it hybrid. Most migration tools will give you an option to tick off to do that, but you still have to go register that Azure Blob Storage account. Depending on the size, you might have to pay for that separately per month. There are a few steps involved, but again, just things to consider. And if you're going on-prem, then does it make sense to do a database attached or a tool-based approach? I had a client recently that was concerned because SharePoint 2007 was going out of extended support, and they wanted to stay on-prem because they had hundreds of SSRS reports that they were using SharePoint to showcase. And SharePoint 2016 was determined to be the target, but they didn't want to pay for a migration tool. So we did a database attached. So we had hopped that from 07 to 10, 10 to 13, 13 to 16.
How much does that cost them in labor versus buying the data?
4 times the tool.
I will also say is that their application that they were using this for was heavily customized in SharePoint 2007. And it was kind of Wild West customized, not the right customized, right? Because in 2007, nobody was properly customizing SharePoint. So we're talking about like DL files being dropped into the GAC. We're talking about WebPAR files just being uploaded directly. We're talking about VB.NET being used behind the scenes for some of the code. It was a mess. So we had to rebuild all of that code while maintaining all the same IDs because they had quite a few terabytes of data there. And honestly, I think given how tied up in a knot this environment was, I think a migration tool would not have worked. But that being said, this was a legacy system. It worked. They were not interested in rebuilding the system, and it would have probably cost them 10x the amount if we had to re-architect the entire system. So again, there's pros and cons to each approach. It all depends on what your needs are. Yeah. Trial migrations, I'd also recommend that for a few things. Before you do your first production migration, do a few trials. Make sure your runbook is accurate, make sure the tool works, make sure your bandwidth is there, make sure you're not bringing down your production farm when you're doing the migration because it can't keep up with both your migration and its existing workload. And then for the most complicated ones, like if you have customizations, really treat that as a full software development lifecycle. Develop those components on the new platform first, do your testing, get your business sign off, and then worry about moving the content over at a later phase.
How exactly do you do those trial migrations if you're talking about things that are incredibly complex that involve, AD, Azure AD Connect and things of that nature that you can't easily just say, oh, we'll just do that in the demo tenant. Well, the demo tenant doesn't have an AD domain associated to it.
Great question. So in traditional on-premises infrastructures, you would have your production farm, you would have your staging or test farm. Some companies had 5 layers of farms in between. In Office 365, it really doesn't matter. You can have a development site collection sitting right beside a production site collection, sitting right beside a staging site collection. The only time it matters is that if you're looking at some of the shared services. So if you're customizing a managed property that will affect everyone, you probably want to do that in a separate tenant and properly vet that first. But for things, you need to make as many site collections as you want, right? Just test them out and delete them afterwards.
Okay.
Now, if you're building a customization, like let's say you're building a really complex workflow, it was built using Mintex on-prem 10 generations ago. You're trying to rebuild it using Flow or SharePoint Designer 2013. So you could also build 2010 workflows, like Bob German walked us through a few sessions ago. You would really want to test that out. So you want to create a bunch of test content. You want to test it yourself first, make sure it works correctly. Invite your business to come test it with sample content. Verify that the customization aspect is working correctly, and then migrate the content over. So you can migrate some content over, but just call it like test, not production or whatever else. The good part is if you're looking at the migration tools, so ShareGate obviously doesn't have any kind of restrictions for how much content you move. But if you're looking at Metalogix or AvePoint, they charge per gigabyte or per terabyte. But if you work with them, they actually don't charge you for remigrating the same content. So if you license a site collection that you have on-prem that's 100 gig, you could remigrate that site collection 1,000,000 times. It would only count 100 gig against your license. But talk with them. I think there's something they have to some flag they have to flag for something or another. But you're not burning your license on these trials. Yes.
I think they also have unlimited. Metalogix says that.
Metalogix has unlimited.
I can't talk about that. It's not public information.
So.
Yeah, I don't know if it's public information, but these vendors are pretty flexible when you work with them. That's all I can say. Okay, so next is managing customizations. So when you look at any customization of your environment, first figure out how widespread is it, how critical is the functionality, and can we leave it where it is today? I've done, I don't know how many dozens of migrations myself and led large teams. That third largest migration I mentioned earlier, I had a 90-person team throughout the course of the project. We really stood up an army to make this happen. It was about 5.5 terabytes of just collaborations plus a bunch of custom things. I've also done solo migrations. So I've seen the full spectrum. And no matter how you look at it, most companies want to move everything to the cloud. Very few are successful in doing so because costs are too much, things are not compatible, something will be retired in a year anyways, why would we pay to rebuild it? So if you go in with the mindset that a hybrid will probably be a good solution in most cases, it helps you avoid some of these edge cases that would be, a disproportionate amount of effort required for a little value. So look at the overall value and importance of what you have. Look at the customization type. If it's something like Nintex or K2, it's really easy to migrate because they're all backwards compatible for the most part. I remember I was doing a migration once from 07 to 2010 in ChorusWorks, which was a huge platform back then. They had absolutely no migration path from version 7 to 8 of their product. So when we were doing an upgrade, there was no way to actually migrate all of those millions of web parts that were custom configured across the farm. But most cases, reach out to the vendor if they're still around, and they'll probably help you with migration tools or scripts. Look at open source, and really just start to classify, do we have the source code to this? Who owns the IP behind this? Is it something open source? There's plenty of great things that are on Codeplex and now GitHub that just don't work and they no longer have support. So if those are the cases, you might need to abandon it or bring in a developer that knows and can fix it. Unfortunately, with open source, a lot of things do die after the person makes it. So we have to be mindful of that. When you look at Office 365, as Deb mentioned earlier, see if you can map the functionality to something out of the box. Chances are it will not be a one-to-one fit, but many cases it's close enough where you could leverage something that did not exist before.
I think it's part of your change management process of this whole thing, because that's a huge component of this as well. It is getting an organization to understand this change and getting them to change their processes, or maybe even organizing their processes, even developing processes.
Yeah. That's a good point. And then migration strategy, lift and shift is usually a strategy for those companies that are driving this as an IT project of shutting down the existing on-prem servers. But there's a lot of ways to do it. I mean, SharePoint Framework is the latest platform to build customization in 365. And the truth is, if you have a lot of very complex on-prem customizations, depending on how well they were built to begin with, it's not that complicated to rebuild them. So if they've isolated their presentation layer from their business logic layer, from their data layer, a lot of times you can get away with just rebuilding that presentation layer using the latest framework, toss the rest of it into like a web service behind the scenes in Azure, and really minimize the code rewrite that you have to do. If they were written using like visual web parts where you just drag things onto the screen and you double click and you add actions, you'll need to pretty much rebuild that. So the SharePoint framework along with React, that's what Microsoft is investing heavily in at the moment as they're rebuilding all of SharePoint using this new client-side technology. It's really where you want to focus your efforts if you're rebuilding things. So I wouldn't recommend doing SharePoint hosted apps or provider hosted apps anymore. They should all be part of the SharePoint framework. Okay. So here we talked about going through the full SDLC, right? SDLC means validating requirements or writing the requirements if they were never written in the first place, design the solution, implement the solution, create sample content to test it with, deploy into a test environment. That environment could be a separate site collection in your same prod tenant. Negotiate on differences because it's never going to be identical to an on-prem version. It's just platform differences. It is what it is. And then deploy the customizations ahead of the content migration. So if you do this correctly, when it comes time to migrate that site, you're only moving the content, and the content fits in perfectly into the new structure that you've just developed as a new solution. So that content migration should be treated almost similarly to the normal team site migration at that point. Any questions before migration runbook? Okay, so your migration runbook should be a clear set of checkboxes for what you need to do when it comes time to do the actual day of the migration. I mentioned this earlier, you should not be doing any kind of Olympics in your minds at this point. Everything should have been thought through, analyzed, if there was doubt, tested, and now you're just, okay, here are the 18 things, we could do it. A lot of times when we build large-scale migration programs, we will do all of the heavy lifting and the effort in the first half of the program. So many times nothing gets moved until the second half of the program begins. And that is when you could typically onboard a lot more junior people to come in and basically just crank the wheel, go through the checklist, and build up experiences as they're going through that aspect. I mentioned I had a 90-person team for that other migration. It wasn't 90 people for the entire duration. We had a core set of about 12 for the first 6 months. And then once we established how the processes would run, then we scaled out to a team that could just go and crank the wheel and take care of it. So the other part is this runbook should also be a living document, because as you do migrations, you're going to learn things that you didn't see before, you didn't know before, you might have to tweak it. So don't print out a copy and put it on everyone's desk. It should be a living, breathing document with ongoing changes. That being said, I would advise against making changes during a migration batch. Wait until that batch is over at the end of the week, and then make changes in the next version. So here's what a sample migration runbook could look like. I'm not going to read line by line, but in essence, it defines the activities that you take 30 days before that site is migrated. Everything from reminding the site owners that it's coming, all the way down to when you're doing T-0, which means you're starting to migrate, and what you're doing after you migrate, which is T+1 and so forth. You could take a look at this deck offline. And again, this is just a sample. A migration runbook will typically be somewhere between 15 and 20 pages long in most scenarios. It could be longer if it's a really complicated environment, or it could be really short if it's a really simple environment. This doesn't so much apply if you have 2 site collections and you're clicking the migrate button. This applies more if you're doing this company-wide. Okay, any questions behind the runbook? It's kind of hard to really showcase a runbook without it being extremely dry, because it's just checkboxes and checkboxes of things to do. So known iron database. So this is like a standard ITIL term. I did not invent this term. And it basically means document root causes when problems arise, and make sure that you have the workarounds that you can refer to once a problem has occurred. If you don't already have a known error database for your existing environment, I would highly recommend starting one tomorrow. This does not have to be only for migration projects. It should really be, okay, we ran into this problem and here's how we resolved it. Your support desk can be that much faster with answering it next time, or if you're a one-person shop, you can refer to your own knowledge base. So if you have a service desk that does have an established known error database, leverage that during your migration project, because weird environments all have their quirks. And if there's already something that's documented, it saves everyone the headache of trying to get to the root of it. Can't tell you how many times we're in the middle of a migration project and some default out-of-the-box behavior on the source platform is just now functioning the way it's supposed to function. So then you look, there's no customizations deployed. You look, you see that there's no branding applied. Like, there's no reason why this this document library is missing the ability to define the description field. Like, it's just completely bizarre. And in that one scenario, the service desk actually had, it wasn't a formal known error database, but they had a list of known issues. And apparently that site collection was corrupted when some drive died on a database server, and they know that it's a problem, and things like this have been happening before. So instead of me, essentially opening up a Premier ticket with Microsoft, getting them to come in, because it's a platform out-of-the-box challenge, they were able to resolve that within a couple hours at most. So important to have. And build on top of the database as you go through it. And the other part is, when you do have a problem that you need to correct and document, make sure you go and update your runbook. Right? So your runbook should say, okay, now that the site's migrated, conduct these 15 tests. Verify the page opens, verify that these libraries are there. And if you have a content editor web part on this page, double check that the contents came over, because there was a problem in the first batch that now all content editor web parts came over, or the titles of the, things like that. So it should be a workflow to make sure that it's there. And then assign a team to go through all your existing content and see if the same problem had occurred before, it just hasn't been reported. Right? So if we notice a problem, and the content editor is a classic problem that keeps coming up. Microsoft fixes it and then it reappears 6 months later. The problem is that now all of the titles and content of the content editor web part always come through successfully. And there's no reason for it. We've tried it ourselves using PowerShell code. We've done it with C#. Half the time it works, half the time it doesn't. We open it with Microsoft, they fix it, and we've seen it appear again a year later or 6 months later. But things like that, if some user reports to you saying, oh, my content editor is missing this title, that's great. You can fix that for this batch. You can add that to the runbook. But you should go back and look at every other content editor web part that you've migrated and make sure the undiscovered issues doesn't exist there. Any questions about the known error database? Okay, so mitigating user description, right? So if we take a look at the perspective from a business user's
angle to a migration project, right? So IT tells me that they're moving my stuff to a different platform, right? The new platform will probably have differences. Will I still be able to be productive with how I'm using it? I don't know. They just told me they're moving me. I know something's coming. How is that going to impact me? Is this going to be a negative impact to my day-to-day life? And if I have questions, who can I talk to? Right? Think of like a blast, like no reply emailer coming into your inbox that says your site is scheduled to be migrated in 30 days. Right? Like, who do I contact? They told me I'm not going to have access to my content for some days while they do the migration. What does that mean, like, for my team? And as we're all working long hours to like work on things, what does that mean? They tell me as my URLs are changing, and it's going to be hard for my team to find it because they've all bookmarked it, and there's hundreds of bookmarks all over the place. What are we going to do there? And what happens if my content is not successful? Like, am I just stuck here in limbo until someone figures something out? Like, I can't go months without using these tools that I'm using daily because it's important to me. And then IT, as much as I like IT, if they tell me that this is successful, how can I really trust that they're not lying? Because it's in their interest to say everything went well. It's in my interest to actually validate that. But how can I validate that? I mean, there's so many sites, subsites, documents. I can't open every document, every link, right? And then if I do have a problem after the migration, who do I reach out to? If I get an email that says your site migration is beginning as read-only, then 2 days later I get an email that says your site's been migrated, here's a new URL. Like, what is that mechanism for me to get help if I need help? And I know if I open a service desk ticket, last time it took 4 days to get back to me, like, what's going on here? So these are very common concerns from the business aspect. And to them, these are all disruptions to their lives. They don't care about the technology, they don't care about the platform, they just know they need a place that they can go and share documents and collaborate and work on deliverables together. And you're telling them you're gonna do something that could break how they work, right? So the first thing to mitigate that is strong and timely communications. You cannot over-communicate in a migration project. You want to make sure everyone's aware that it's coming and announce that multiple times. Make sure that there's no doubt that someone will come to you and say, hey, you caught me blindsided by this email. I had no idea this migration program was coming. And then you can point them to the 6 emails you've sent them, the 5 posters, all these other campaigns that you've been doing, and really show that it's really on them that they've been putting blind eyes to what's happening. Offer training and webinars. Most people here are probably on the IT side, and we see Office 365 something very easy to use, right? We click and drag things, and boom, it's there. We click on a document, and we have a preview. We click into it, we add properties, we add metadata. It comes very easy to us. For a lot of people that are not tech savvy or are just not familiar with Office 365, it's really a scary thing. We're working with one client right now that we're helping migrate from Jive onto Office 365. And part of our role is to help them analyze some of their Jive content. Now, I've never used Jive before as a user. And a lot of the stuff I'm clicking on, like, I have no idea what I'm doing. like they have Jive developers on their team that are helping us out. But like, if I click here, why am I seeing this on this side of the screen? Or like, if I'm starting to search, why is it not taking me to all search? Like, there's a lot of million little things that make no sense to me because I don't know Jive. And now I really understand what end users feel like when they go to SharePoint or 365 for the first time. They just, as simple as it is, they just don't know. So it's really important to provide training and ongoing webinars. And it's not just a one-time thing that, okay, we're migrating in December, we're going to host a workshop today for 1 hour to showcase the platform and we're done. Right? These need to be part of your whole marketing campaign internally for ongoing sessions, whether pre-recorded, on-demand, live sessions. You gotta get your users excited and informed before this move happens.
If I can add, because I've worked with some companies, they feel the training webinars are over as soon as we go live. Should be all pre-training. We've had to do this for a couple of weeks afterwards, and these people weren't there, or maybe they went to the training and went, yeah, and now they're using it and going, yeah.
I would push it further. I'd say not even a few weeks.
I agree.
I would say it should be ongoing. It should be a monthly ongoing aspect in all companies. Because, first of all, people are joining your company for the first time over the course of a month. People are changing their roles where now they might have more responsibilities. People might forget. People might have been using other tools and not as familiar with this. I mean, there's no harm to doing so. Now, we're all strapped with time. So pre-recording webinars and making those available is a great way to mitigate a lot of those challenges. An even better way would be to put together a user group within your organization where you can have your champions in different parts of the organization. And honestly, what's worked really well for finding champions is to find people that are very young in the company. And I know that sounds ageist or whatever you want to call it, but the youngest people in the organization are going to be the most willing to learn and most eager to learn. They're also looking to make a name for themselves and actually differentiate themselves and be helpful to the experts that are sitting around them that have been doing this for 20 plus years, right? So if you recruit a lot of champions to come in and really help do that, it really helps drive adoption. We'll talk about that, I guess, in the adoption phase. But it's a great way of doing so. And usually if you get a few champions across different divisions within the company, bring them together on a monthly basis, give them some kind of user group status, it helps them move their career further along. But it also helps you distribute information out to those divisional areas. And it helps those divisional areas when they have questions to have someone that they can go to instead of just be frustrated and give up on IT, give up on the platform, and go back to using personal email to share files. Okay, so the other part here is for the mitigating the disruption. Put together like a migration questions Yammer group if you have Yammer, or a shared mailbox, or have open door sessions where maybe you camp out a few tables in your company cafeteria. People come in and just ask questions, right? Have an open door so people can communicate back to IT with any problems. You can look at strategies for minimizing the read-only window for migrations. Like we were mentioning earlier, migrate everything behind the scenes, freeze it for the delta, do the delta. It sounds great. It works okay in practice. The reason being is that all of these tools are really good at migrating content that's new or changed. But if you delete a piece of content on the source, they typically will not delete it on the target. So there's some things to it, but just playing it wisely as you go through that process. Implement a URL redirection strategy. If you're moving to Office 365, your URLs will 100% change, unless you own some .SharePoint subdomain already, .com. So put a URL redirection in place. There's simple ways of doing it, and there's more advanced ways of doing that. A simple way could just be to create an ISAPI filter on your existing web front ends that will go match from a list of URLs and map them to where the target is. This works particularly well if you want to map not just the root URLs of the sites, but also the documents and everything else underneath it. A simple, less ISAPI approach could be to go through and just put a JavaScript redirect link on those sites in the header that says this site is removed, click here to access the new one. You'll be redirected in 3 seconds. Other options include using existing redirection services you might have. If you Google the topic, there's a million different ways to do it, but most companies don't do it. So do it, your users will thank you. Make sure that you have a fallback strategy in place in part of your runbook. So if I'm migrating a site and I'm getting a catastrophic error because Office 365 starts timing out on me nonstop, or this person had a lot of exe files in their document library in their current ungoverned environment, and now it's breaking as I'm migrating it. How the way to roll it back? And roll it back is really simple in this scenario. You just unfreeze their on-premises version of their site collection and send them an email that says, you've been rolled back. We'll schedule you for a later date. They don't need to know that there's already a copy of the data in the cloud. You can just delete that later or figure out how you mitigate that. But if you don't have a fallback strategy in place, the migration team is pulling their hair out. How do we fix these EXEs in there? Let's open a ticket with Microsoft to get them to enable these content types. Microsoft will not do it. It's a lot of chaos for no reason. So just have a simple fallback in place. Most migrations we do, I'd say probably around 1% of the sites require some level of fallback. And when it happens, it's not a big deal. Just don't let this happen in the very beginning. So start with the better sites to build that positive momentum. Ask for feedback throughout the process. Like I just had my car serviced at the dealership. I got an email the next day saying, how was your service? How was the cleanliness? Did you have to, use the restrooms? How were they maintained? Like the whole 9 yards. And I submitted feedback because, I thought they did a great job. I thought it was a nice place. And that helped them understand whether what they're doing is working or not. At the same time, if I left awful feedback, that would give them the feedback to improve the service for next time. Treat your site owners like your clients, right? And send them surveys and let them come back and explain what worked well, what you could do better, and continue to evolve that migration runbook that you have as you go through the process. The other part is provide validation reports. And a lot of companies, when they provide validation reports to end users, they kind of delete all of the stuff that failed. They have to manually redo in the log files. And they share like a crystal clean version of the logs. Like, look, it says 100 out of 100 successes, right? Just be transparent with them. Say, look, we tried this first. Here are the things that failed. Here are the things that we had to remigrate. Here's what we had to manually fix. And let them be aware of that. It'll build trust, but they'll also have the confidence that what you're saying went well actually went well. And don't be afraid to share those reports with them, right? A lot of clients that I've worked with do not want to actually share those validation reports with the end users. They'll just send them an email that says your site has been migrated, please validate, and we'll put the URL redirection in place. Be a little more transparent. It helps build a better relationship. And of course, find an easy way to contact the migration team during post-migration testing and sign-off. Some companies will assign one of the migration engineers to a specific site owner or site collection that they can reach out to them directly. Other companies will create prioritized queues in their remedy or their ticketing systems. Other companies have other teams that they could call or take shifts working a WebEx bridge. I've seen it done a million different ways, but the point is there should be an easy way for a site owner to get in touch with the team, not just before, but during it as well. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so driving business adoption. So we talked about building this project marketing campaign to inform your users about this project, this migration that's coming. At the end of the project, convert this marketing campaign into an ongoing marketing initiative. So part of that includes ongoing training. Part of that could include ongoing highlights of how-tos, right? Put a poster on the wall for a month that says, do you know how you can create additional columns for your lists? Or did you know that you could co-author in Excel? Simple things like those. Keep them engaged and interested of new things that are coming or things that are there that they might not be aware of. And with that user group that we talked about earlier, during those user group sessions, they don't have to be like our user groups here where, we talk about some changes and then there's a topic of interest. It should be people that are champions in the organization showing off what they're working on, what they're doing, more of a discussion of what works well, what challenges they're seeing, what they would like to see. And then maybe have someone from IT show like a quick 15-minute demo of some new functionality that, is a little bit more complicated than entry level. So that's one part. The other part is treat your governance as an ongoing set of reviews and improvements. Don't let that governance document just die in a document library somewhere. Right? Treat that as something that is really dictating what this technology platform is doing and can be doing to meet your business objectives. And you get those business objectives by having your governance committee being made up of representatives from all your different divisions that should be in touch with what the business objectives are. So you have this nice, ecosystem that you're establishing for ongoing maintenance. Also, look at your analytics, right? Determine if your adoption goals are met. A lot of companies ask, how do I know if I have more or less adoption when I move to the cloud? And most companies don't really keep too much analytics on-prem. So one thing that we like to do at the very beginning of migration projects is to actually go and sign up for a free Google Analytics account and go distribute that to all of the master pages on the existing platform and start tracking who's actually using things so that we have a baseline that we can compare to after we migrate to Office 365. And in most cases, with the proper marketing campaign of this new migration project, we're seeing a very strong increase to that. The other thing is Microsoft also created a content pack for Power BI that actually pulls into a million different sources within Office 365. It gives you some very nice dashboards for where your users are, what they're using, which technologies, which time of the month, which time of the day. Really great stuff. It's a free pack that you can download. You just need a license for Power BI to be able to use it, but check it out. So that's all I had for today. We are sponsoring SharePoint Saturday New England. That's coming up at the end of October. And if you have anyone else that you think would be benefited from seeing this session, I'm actually presenting this session again at SharePoint Saturday. So that being said, connect with me on LinkedIn, follow me on Twitter. I will post a link to this deck to the meetup site that we had for this event. And I'll take any other questions before I hand it back to Mike.
Covered it all. You did a great job. All right.
Thank you. All right. So let's take a look at some upcoming community events. All right. Here are a bunch of the other local user groups. So pretty much whatever your favorite component of Office 365 or other tech goodness is, there's probably a user group for it out here in the Boston area. So
What's the link user group going to do now? Skype for businesses, can you go away?
it'll become the Teams user group. So I've actually attended that user group a couple of times, and that's largely populated by PBX specialists and infrastructure guys. They are very hardcore, and it's a very educational group. So I highly recommend attending that group. It's been...
Just add one thing that they're also doing very well with that user group. So when SharePoint user groups or 365 user groups, we kind of all run our own show all across the country and the world. With Skype for Business, it's actually centrally managed. Microsoft plays a big part in that. So they're very well connected to all the other user groups that are also doing Skype for Life or what have you. And they also have a lot of great content, sponsorships, and things in that area. So it's a good example of how to run a network of user groups. So check it out for the organizational platform, if nothing else.
All right. Upcoming events. October 28th, which is a week from this Saturday, is the SharePoint Saturday New England. So this is going to be hosted by apparently every SPUG on the planet, and it's going to be right here in this building. And every single organizer of this group is going to be doing a presentation there. So I'll be doing a presentation on Teams. As Dimitri just mentioned, he'll be doing a repeat of this session that he just did there. And David, who is not here, is also doing a session that I don't know what it's about. So, and the whole program is 9 to 5. So it's an all-day thing. I think there's about 20 tracks, so 20 different classes that you can choose from, and then we're ending with a keynote, and there's going to be a big raffle, and joy and happiness and lots of free.
Nice little page with the agenda on it.
Yeah.
Really cool to see the talks, some good stuff.
Yeah, lots of really good stuff.
Oh, yeah,
and there's
and it's completely free.
Yeah, the whole thing's free. There's going to be food, probably. I don't know what the raffle prizes are, but it's sponsored by Microsoft and it's here in this building. So yeah, I'm sure there'll be lots of Microsoft goodies. And there's also all kinds of other swag presented by all the other sponsors. So really good time. And just so you guys know, this represents a consolidation. So in previous years, there have been numerous SharePoint Saturdays. So there's been the Granite State SharePoint Saturday and a Boston SharePoint Saturday and a Hartford SharePoint Saturday. That's not happening anymore. So those are all being consolidated into this one. So now we have SharePoint Saturday New England, and that's going to be it. So I hope you guys can make it. It should be really fun. And on December 6th, there's also the SharePoint Workshop and Expo. And I don't know anything about that. So other than it's on December 6th and it runs from 9 to 4.
You don't know where.
It'll be here as well.
Oh, here?
Is that free to attend? Also free. Nice. Okay. All right.
Before you go on to the next thing, I saw on Redmond.com that there's going to be a SharePoint conference next spring.
Yeah.
Bringing back the SharePoint conference. It's mad.
Yeah, so it's not a Microsoft conference,
Oh.
but Microsoft has a ton of speakers at it.
Yes.
So Microsoft has a rule that they cannot do a product-specific conference anymore. So there's a team of people that run the European SharePoint conference, which is not Microsoft, and they've been invited to come run it here. And Jeff Teeper's the keynote, but it's not a Microsoft conference.
That sounds like an interesting way of sidestepping those rules.
In May.
All right. So next month, I will be repeating the same session that I'm doing at SharePoint Saturday, which will be the evolution of Microsoft Teams. And I'll be doing not only a deep dive on what Teams is and how we can use it, but also half of the session is going to be a case study on a Teams migration that I completed back in July for a marketing company that now has a team that they use as extranets for each of their clients. We apparently have 2 of those. All right. Any other community announcements? Anybody here know of any other events that I've missed out on? Any other cool free trainings?
SharePoint framework, I think there's one on the 27th.
SharePoint framework?
Oh, that's a great point. So Skyler and Bob German are hosting an all-day free SharePoint framework developer bootcamp here the day before SharePoint Saturday. It's a great point. We should have this slides before we publish them.
Yeah.
If you follow Bob German or Skyler, they have that posted. If you also are on the SharePoint Saturday mailing list, their last email blast contains a link at the bottom. They talk about it.
He's going to Bright also.
Oh, perfect.
Bright.
Okay.
So, just there for.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah. Any other events? Anybody? Okay. Anybody looking to hire? Yeah.
I don't know. So we are expanding our team in the Boston area. If you're a developer or an admin or do anything with SharePoint or Office 365, come talk to me. We might have full-time as well as contract opportunities in the near future.
All right. And then my favorite part, anybody have any issues or tips that they've run into with Office 365 that they were hoping to maybe find an answer to today? Nobody?
Has anyone tried that recent announcement about conditional formatting? Yeah.
About conditional formatting. I'm not sure what you're referring to.
I've seen the demos of it at a
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it because I'm fed up with it.
If you look at your message center, they just announced when they would start rolling it out. I don't know what that date is. But it's in one of the announcements in this one. I'm having a weird problem with OneDrive.
Okay.
So I have a personal MS account as well as a corporate account with the same email address.
Yeah.
Oh, joy, one of those.
I know that problem.
Shared with me on my personal accounts from another personal account, actually Mike's accounts. But when I try to go sync that down to my client, my corporate account doesn't recognize that as valid, and OneDrive for Business client doesn't let me log into my personal account because it sees that the corporate account already exists.
Yeah.
I'm going to submit a bug to Microsoft, but if anyone's run into this,
I used to have an account like that and they put the kibosh on it.
Yeah, that's a bug.
So believe it or not,
It was like, no, you're 2 separate coming up to new identity.
Oh, the partner portal.
yeah, the new partner center.
I can't even get in.
So I just got migrated to the new partner center and it dropped all of my credentials. They're like, you're now a registered partner. I was like, I was a silver partner last week. What happened? They did the same thing to you? Yeah.
Explorer, or have you gone to both? Okay.
Yeah. They also told me I had to have all of my techs re-register and re-enroll with the company when they migrated that. So that was awesome. I still haven't done it. I have an open ticket with them about that.
They didn't listen to the migration.
They clearly didn't. Yeah, they could have benefited a lot from that. Instead, I just started getting alerts that my partnership was no longer valid.
Has anyone who's done a migration here used the SharePoint migration tool that Microsoft was in beta that is now GA, I guess?
I haven't used that yet. I might start using it in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. Are you positive it's out of the tap?
They announced that it's out of tap.
Did they?
Yeah.
I've downloaded it and like tried it, but I haven't really.
I haven't
You're
seen
the one
it.
that does files only, right?
The SPMT, their acronym, the SharePoint migration tool is what I believe it's short for, but no, we haven't seen or heard too many people who have used it. the demos we saw from the product team that Microsoft were like a little less than descriptive on how it was going to be working the best use case for it.
So there's two tools. One is the fast track tools that they use.
So this tool is being leveraged by Fast Track. It's also available to the public, from what I understood.
Okay. Let me Google a few things and we can talk. Over a bit.
Yeah, so I haven't used that yet, but I am going to be taking a hard look at it and checking it out. So definitely more on that in the future. Anybody else?
Something I noticed is that I said we have to do in my tenant. So that's nice.
Yeah. Yep.
Like that when I get his report going on it.
To do is there. I can tell you something about the team stuff that I've been doing. Is apparently as a part of the re-architecture of the user permissions that they're doing as a part of the Teams system. And I'm not sure, Dimitri, maybe you know this, if this is that a part of the new SharePoint framework, or is that something that's above and beyond that and specific to Teams? And what I specifically ran into is while being logged on as a global administrator, I got a access denied permission when trying to access a team. Now, that team was created by a different user than I was logged on as. So it was provisioned, and ironically, it was provisioned by a user who was not a global admin. So it was just done through Microsoft's self-provisioning system. But when I was logged in as a global administrator, I could not get in.
How long ago was it created?
It was created back when it was a group. So yeah.
You have to have yourself as a group admin.
Yeah. To each individual group. Yeah. That's not fun. ShareGate. ShareGate was the answer that I came up with for that, but that is very problematic. And I'm hoping to see that they come up with a workaround for that.
So just to jump back to that previous question, I can talk about this. So yes, Microsoft has released that migration tool.
Yeah.
They announced it September 26th.
I was going to say they did 2 sessions on it at Ignite, so I figured it had to be kind of out of the box.
I've used it. It works well for files. It doesn't do anything besides files.
How big?
I just did it in testing capacity.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think a few gigabytes would have been the most.
From what I understood, Fast Track sneakily also changed their model for helping anyone 150 seats and under, and I think they raised that limit to like 250 or 500 seats now. And that those things kind of happen in 10% of the scale migration.
It's still a V1 tool.
Is it?
Yeah.
All I can say.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on, happy to have more of this conversation afterwards. We're going to go out for drinks afterwards for the Drink 365. So feel free to join us then, and our answers get far more creative at those sessions. So it'll be fun and a little bit more honest sometimes too. We just wanted to thank our sponsor, Backupify. Thank you very much for the glorious spread that you provided to us yet again. That was awesome. So thank you very much. And now on to our raffle. So these are the prizes that we have up for grabs for our raffle. It's basically a $25 gift certificate from each of the founders here and a 1-month subscription to Pluralsight training. So we want people to raise their hand and not just shout out the answers so that we can actually hand out a prize. Here's question number 1. What are some of the ways to mitigate user disruption during your migrations? Anybody? Anybody? Deb?
You have to redirect all URLs to the new URLs. feedback during the process also. Okay.
So-
I'd say everything but D.
Everything but D? That doesn't seem to be a valid answer there. Would you like to try again?
That's correct.
Is that correct?
It's in the notes.
A, B, and C.
Oh, answer A, B, or C. There you go. What are some of the ways? Okay, I'm sorry. I thought it was a pick one. Very good. All right. Would you like a gift certificate, a gift certificate, a gift certificate, or a training? All right, very good. We will take care of that. I have your email address, so I'll send you mine. Next question. Oh, I skipped one. Next question. Again, please raise your hand. How do you prevent your new platform from going stale? Good question. I like it. Yes, sir.
D. So all of them will.
D, all of the above. That is correct. Awesome. All right. Do you have a business card or something with an email address that you can get to us? And which would you like? We're down to a gift certificate, or a training. All right. Very good. So question number 3. When is SharePoint Saturday New England?
I'm going to say Ferraro got the first hand up.
You, sir.
20.
B is correct. Very good. And same deal. Yeah. Email address or business card?
And gift certificate.
Gift certificate. Very good. What happened?
You control tab.
I did. I didn't mean to.
Oh, sorry, alt tab. I'm going to try alt F4.
Is it this one? What happened? All right. How many active users does Microsoft have on Office 365? It was in the updates at the beginning.
B.
That is incorrect.
Well, B is correct.
Not according to the answer in your notes.
It's 100 million.
I mean, correct. Good job. There you go. They lost one. They lost one now. All right. Very good. So, Arthur, you now have a free month of Pluralsight training. So, congratulations.
So we do have one more raffle with Datto.
Oh yeah, Datto wanted to do a raffle.
Yeah, well, in order to enter, actually, you would need to schedule a call with us. This is just gonna be like 15, 20 minutes, and I can give you guys access to my calendar. Most choose slots for you.
Awesome.
If anyone's interested, you can just give me your business card after this, and I promise I won't.
Yeah, Saul is the one who sells.
Yeah,
She's the
you
best.
left.
Nice. All right. Well, in addition to Backupify, we wanted to do a quick thanks to all of our past sponsors. There are many of them here. And if any of you know of anybody who might be interested in sponsoring any of our future events, please let them know that we're very open to that. And they don't necessarily have to be as generous on their spread as Datto is. So that's pretty awesome. Yeah, let us know. Also, we also have an open call for any speakers. So if you guys are interested in doing any presentations, if you have any information that you'd like to share with the group, please feel free. Okay, we're always open to that.